I stood there, taking in the whole scene. I saw the elegant restaurant, the glasses of wine, the soft laughter, and there she was, the center of my world. She was sitting at the table with him, laughing as they shared a moment of joy. I held the divorce papers in my hands. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins, but my face remained unshaken. I already knew everything, every lie, every excuse, every look she gave me, while hiding secrets behind a forced smile. The worst had happened. I had decided to end it in the most surgical way. I had the opportunity to do it in the most surgical way. She was unaware of my presence. I didn't know. I had already discovered everything. Her lover, the man she said she wanted, was so caught up in a game of seduction that he barely noticed what was going on around him. As I approached, I felt the shock wave that hit her as soon as she saw me. Her face turned pale, her lips trembled, but she did her best to remain calm. That's when I gently placed the letter on the table between her glass of wine and her plate. She looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode, and in a way it was. Her eyes showed the shock she felt, but then something incredible happened. I saw tears well up in his eyes, and I wasn't sure if they were from remorse or pure despair. She tried to say something, but it was hard to make out over the noise in the room. He tried to justify the betrayal with words that seemed pathetic as they came out of his mouth. "It's not what you think," she murmured, her voice breaking.
This is our Life channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please join us to stay updated with more real stories happening around you.
But I didn't need to hear any more. I knew everything I had followed. I had watched her every move, and it broke my heart to see her hurt me so deeply. Night after night I could have done something. I could have confronted him earlier, but I chose the right time. Now the lover was there, watching the scene without understanding the full scope of what was happening. I had prepared for this. I was ready for every tear, every plea. But what she didn't know was that her betrayal was not the worst part of this story. I discovered something far greater. He was more than a passing interest. He was an opportunist, a deceiver. She was so trusting, believing she had found true love, while he saw only a chance to get rich at her expense. She never loved me the way I loved her. Now, I am about to learn the price of that choice. In the weeks before, I put on a brave face and believed her excuses about late meetings, friends, and colleagues. She was so sure she had everything under control, but little did she know that with every excuse she made, I was one step ahead, gathering evidence, preparing for the moment when she would finally fall for good. And that moment had arrived. I put the divorce letter on the table, and the lover looked at me, a little uncomfortably. Maybe he knew his game was about to end, or maybe he was just too scared to deal with the fallout. Either way, it was the last time I would see him. And she? Well, she had no idea what was coming next. "I think you should read this," I said, gently taking her hand and pointing to the envelope. She looked at me with teary eyes, trying to maintain what dignity she had left, but her hands were shaking as she opened the paper. I could hear her. Her breathing quickened as she read the words that would end our marriage. But what really destroyed her wasn't the divorce. That's what I said next. Her future with him, I said. I gestured to the man who was now sitting uncomfortably in his chair. "This man you think will give you a new life. He's already on the run. You think he loves you, but all he wanted was your money." She blinked, confused. "I followed you for weeks. I know every penny you wired to him, every investment you made. He cheated you. You as much as he cheated you. I am hurt, and I am angry." The effect of those words it was immediate. The lover. Until then, he'd been silent. But then he started to move a little. I smiled warmly. I watched with a smile as he tried his best to keep his cool. He hadn't expected this. Neither did she. She had disappointed me. It was like a dream that didn't exist, and now she was caught in a web of lies that she had helped create. The irony of it all was that the moment she needed him most, he would leave her without him. In retrospect, it's heartbreaking. He's going to leave you, I continued. When that happens, you'll have nothing. I won't be there for you, and our children won't have a mother. You won't have any money either. You thought. The tears finally came. Tears of regret, maybe. But it was too late for that. She tried to call me, tried to ask for one last chance, but it was her time. She had used up all her time. The game was over. Now all she had to do was watch the house of cards she had built crumble. And I, for the first time in a long time, felt free. But then something happened to her. The lover ran away. She left, just like I did that night. It was a heartbreaking outcome, but it was something I had foreseen. But sadly, she had to deal with the consequences. What happened to that poor woman? What did she discover after that fateful dinner? Well, you are going to want to know. Welcome, my dear friend, to our little channel. Here, we're all about supporting each other and celebrating our journeys, especially when it comes to relationships. All the stories you'll hear here are fictional, but based on real-life experiences. We want to show you how betrayal can destroy lives and relationships in ways that can't be undone. The moral of each story is clear, and we hope you enjoy them. Those who betray always pay the price. Prepare yourself for a heartbreaking tale full of unexpected twists and turns. So, buckle up, and let's dive in. It's a good story. John had been carrying the weight of responsibility ever since he married Sarah. To Sarah, from the very beginning, he knew that building a life together would require sacrifices, and he was willing to make every one of them. Sarah was the kind of woman who captivated everyone around her with her long brown hair and a smile that lit up any room. She seemed to be the embodiment of joy. She was the living definition of joy. She was loving. She was attentive, and her easy manner contrasted with John's more rigid and practical attitude. They were a perfect match, and it was clear that they were meant to be together. For many years, that was enough. On the outside, their life was picture perfect, the kind of existence many dream of. They lived in a beautiful neighborhood, surrounded by friends in a close-knit community. John was a well-known attorney who spent long hours at work fighting for causes he believed in. His office in the city was a place where he really stood out, always with a solid stance and strong ethics. Sarah, on the other hand, had a passion for the arts. She worked as an artist. She was a wonderful art teacher at a local school, and she found so much fulfillment in the little things. She loved to work on an unfinished painting, and she was so excited when her class of students organized exhibitions for the new talent in town. They had 2 young children who were the center of John's universe. Their joy and affection made him forget for a moment the stress of work and the challenges of adult life. Their family routine was something they cherished. They ate dinner together and talked about the past, and the children laughed and played around the table. John Proud felt the responsibility to protect the little universe they had so carefully built. But even the best families can have their challenges, and over time, John and Sarah noticed that something was missing in their relationship. They weren't at each other's throats or having massive blowouts, but there was a subtle, underlying tension. It was something. It was more subtle, as if an invisible distance had begun to grow between them. John couldn't ignore it. They didn't have the same conversations they used to have. Silences, those quiet moments, once so comforting, now felt a bit overwhelming. Sarah, who had always been so open with him, now seemed distant, keeping her thoughts to herself. He tried to ignore the signs, but it wasn't easy. At first, Sarah was as busy as he was. Children demanded attention, and work demanded focus. Life sometimes felt like a steady stream of routine, with no room for grand gestures of affection. But deep down, John knew something was different, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Sarah felt it too, but they felt it in different ways. She always had been. She was a dreamer, someone who needed constant inspiration to feel alive. The routine. At first, the routine had felt nice and comfortable, but now it was starting to feel a little too much. She still loved him, John, or at least she thought she did, but deep down she felt that something was missing. Even though her work as a teacher was rewarding, it just didn't seem as fulfilling as it used to be. The days passed, and she found herself more and more lost in distant thoughts at night. searching for meaning in things she hadn't questioned before. Sometimes, she missed who she was before she got married. The freedom she had to explore the world without ties. She didn't talk much about these feelings openly. There was a barrier. They both sensed something wasn't quite right, but neither had the courage to face it. For John, talking about it would be like admitting he'd failed at something he'd sworn to protect: their marriage, their family, the stable life they'd built together. For Sarah, it was hard to talk about. Admitting that she wasn't happy would mean dealing with feelings she couldn't explain, even to herself. Over the past few months, things had become more and more obvious. Sarah started. She was spending more time out of the house, and she always had good reasons. "It's just an art event," she said. "The students need me." John, ever the devoted husband, chose to believe her, or at least he did his best. It was easier that way. It was easier. It was easier. It was easier to accept the explanations than to question them. Besides, he trusted her, Sarah. She had never given him a reason to doubt her, but even that, their bond had become increasingly fragile. At home, their relationship had become more and more mechanical. They talked about the kids' school, the bills, and what they were going to do for dinner that night. Sarah, who had always poured her heart and soul into their relationship, seemed to be withdrawing more and more every day. When John looked into her eyes, he felt like there was a part of her he no longer recognized. It was in the quiet moments when he was alone in his office at night that he felt it most acutely. John began to feel a little unsure. Was something really wrong? Was it him? Was he imagining things when he thought Sarah was pulling away? Or was it just the weight of years and responsibilities taking their toll? These thoughts kept him up at night, and he couldn't stop thinking about them, but the next day, he put on his happy face and tried to pretend that everything was normal. Sarah, on the other hand, felt torn. Deep down, she still cherished the life she had with John, the children, the stability, the respect she had for him. But there was another part of her that felt a little restless and uneasy. She longed for something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She began to reach out to friends, some more liberal, some more conservative, seeking advice and support. But no answer seemed to fit the void she felt. The city where she had lived for so many years didn't seem to have the same charm. For Sarah, every street, every cafe, every park brought back memories of a time when everything seemed perfect, but now made her feel trapped in a life she no longer recognized. She didn't want to hurt John. She knew that. He was a good man, and so were the children. They were everything to her. But there was this nagging feeling, this uneasiness, like something was missing. As time went on, John tried his best to reconnect with Sarah in small ways. He proposed they went out more, planned family trips, and arranged surprises for her. But Sarah, no matter how much she wanted to, couldn't let herself open up completely. It was an effort. She felt guilty and it weighed on her, but at the same time she felt that something inside her had been dormant for too long. She felt alone. That day John came home late. He'd been working late at the office. He'd been called away to deal with an urgent matter at the office, and it was already night when he entered the house. When he got home, the lights were out, and the house was unusually quiet. Sarah was often out socializing with friends or attending work functions. But this feeling of emptiness was especially disturbing to John. He checked his phone. There were no messages or calls. He climbed the stairs. As he climbed the stairs to his room, John couldn't shake the thought that had been nagging at him for weeks. Something was changing. Something was about to happen. He wasn't sure what it was, but he had a feeling that the life he knew wasn't going to be the same. The distance between John and Sarah grew. Every day it seemed to grow a little more. It was heartbreaking to see the emptiness in her eyes. The emptiness in her gestures, once so full of affection, became more and more obvious. John couldn't help but notice. It was clear to him, even as he tried his best to keep the peace at home, that something was wrong. The silence in the room, the excuses for not being together, the lost looks from Sarah when he spoke, all of it was building an invisible wall. Between them he tried to hide. He felt uncomfortable. But a storm began to grow. Inside him, John understood. Something was stirring deep inside him. But he was wrong. The excuses for Sarah's long journeys, the reasons for Sarah's long absences became less and less clear. There was always a reason, something that couldn't be helped, a new excuse that seemed a little more far-fetched each time. He wanted to believe, to her. Had to believe. But my gut was telling me something else. Over the years of practicing law, he'd learned to listen. He knew the truth was out there, just waiting to be found. As time went on, John's mind worked nonstop, trying to make sense of it all. He found himself scanning her gestures, analyzing her words more carefully. Sarah seemed more distant than ever when they were together as a family. She seemed out of place, almost as if she was living another life far away. He tried his best to be a part of the family's usual activities, but it felt like she was worlds away. John felt like he was trying to fight something invisible, something he still couldn't put his finger on. One rainy afternoon, as John was returning home from work, he had the first concrete evidence that something was really wrong. John was walking home from work when he got his first clue that something was really wrong. As he walked down a street near downtown, he saw Sarah enter a coffee shop with a man he didn't know. It didn't seem suspicious at first. It could be a business meeting or a casual encounter, but their behavior, there was a closeness that disturbed him deeply. The way she touched his arm, the stifled laughter, there was something special. He couldn't ignore it. John stopped. The car across the street, his heart was pounding as he felt a racing sensation. The uncertainty, this was it. He had felt it for months. This nagging feeling had been gnawing at him for months, and now it was about to be confirmed. He stood there, watching from a distance with a mixture of pain and disbelief. How could Sarah do this to him? She was the woman he had sworn to love and protect, the mother of his children. They had a beautiful life together. They were a family. It was hard to accept the possibility that it was all falling apart before their eyes, that she was with someone else. The heartwarming moment in the cafe lasted a little longer than John would have liked. They talked for almost an hour, laughing and exchanging looks. There was no denying what was happening. Sarah was having an affair. The reality was stark and brutal. It was a lot to take in, and he felt like his chest was being crushed from the inside. But he didn't react. Not in that moment. Instead, he took a step back, processed the information, and began to think about his next steps. He felt a dull ache in his chest, a sign of the pain he felt from the betrayal, even though it hadn't been fully exposed yet. In the days that followed, John watched Sarah's movements more closely. He didn't want to confront her directly, at least not yet. I knew I needed proof. I had to be sure before I took any steps. He began to look into things. He was careful and discreet. He asked mutual friends to analyze her social networks, checked her bank accounts for suspicious transactions. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. He found messages exchanged on her cell phone, meetings scheduled at times when she said she was at work, and expensive gifts he'd never seen. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a truth he had always feared, but never wanted to admit. As he learned more, John's heart grew cold. The initial pain was replaced with a feeling of coldness. He knew the end was near, and began to plan the final blow. If Sarah was willing to destroy everything they'd built together, he would make sure she paid. John didn't think there was any hope of talking things through or working things out. The betrayal had left a deep, lasting wound that would not be easy to heal. That week, Sarah continued to act as if nothing had happened. She still smiled at her children and pretended that life went on as normal. But John knew the truth, and with every gesture she made, he felt a bitter taste of irony. How could she live with herself? How could she look him in the eye and continue this charade deep down? John was about to lose it, but he held himself together. He was calm. I knew I had to wait for the right moment. It was a Saturday night when it all came out, and then, bam! It all unfolded. Sarah had it. She said she was going to a meeting with friends, which was typical for a weekend night. But John, our dear John, already knew the truth. He had hired a private investigator to follow her, and that night he received photos that confirmed what he already suspected. Sarah wasn't there. She wasn't with her friends. She was with him, the man from the cafe, laughing and sharing a night that should have been theirs. John felt a range of emotions when he saw the pictures, including anger and pain. It was a confirmation of what he had been feeling for weeks, but now it was real form. Sarah had been unfaithful to him. The man with whom she shared glances and laughter was responsible for the destruction of their marriage. John stayed. He sat quietly for hours, lost in thought as he studied the photos, as if trying to make sense of the passage of time. Had stopped at the end of that night? After a while, John made a decision. There was no going back. The love he had for Sarah, the trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship, had been completely destroyed. He knew that things would never be the same again. John knew. This night was going to be hard. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. But he also felt a strange sense of relief at finally being able to end it. This cycle dinner was ready. He had planned everything, every detail carefully calculated so that the truth would come out in a devastating way. Sarah had. He had no idea what was about to happen. He felt safe and secure in his bubble of lies. He believed he could continue to live his double life without consequence. As John put on his suit, he stared at his reflection. In the mirror in his eyes, they showed the exhaustion of weeks of no sleep and hours of silent vigilance. He couldn't quite place when his love for Sarah had become so distant. The anger was gone. What remained was a deep sadness. Now he was determined to uncover the truth and close this chapter of his life with dignity. He wanted justice, not revenge. At least that's what he tried to tell himself. Sarah, on the other hand, was calm. For her, this night was just another night to meet Peter, the man she had secretly come to call her future. For months, she had been carried away by an illusion. She believed that with Peter, she would finally have the exciting life she so desired. He was charming, attentive, and seemed completely in love with her. It was the opposite of the routine security she was used to. John offered. Sarah saw Peter as a chance to break free and start over. Sarah saw an escape, a chance to start over, away from the predictability of marriage. When John arrived at the restaurant, he was greeted by the comforting aroma of delicious food and the soothing sounds of soft music. The elegant setting was filled with couples chatting discreetly, most lost in their own worlds. But Peter was focused on one person in particular, Sarah Peter. He was sure he knew exactly where they were sitting. He had seen her name on the reservation. That made him sure that tonight the farce would finally end. He walked through the restaurant with steady, confident steps, his heart filled with anticipation. When he finally saw them, his stomach gave a little thump. There they were, laughing recklessly. Sarah looked absolutely radiant in the blue dress John had given her for their anniversary. It was a touching moment, as if she was gently taunting him with the memory of what they had once been. He took a few seconds to collect his thoughts before approaching. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm. "Good evening," John said with a gentle smile, as he placed the letter of divorce on the table between the wine glasses. Sarah's gaze instantly froze. Her eyes widened as she saw him standing there, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. Peter, on the other hand, tried to hide his discomfort, but it was clear that he didn't know what to do. John was standing. He stood firm, showing no sign of losing control. "What are you doing?" "Here," Sarah stammered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Finish what you started," Sarah replied to John with controlled coolness. "Open the envelope," he said gently. The room fell silent. The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah took the white envelope, was shaking hands, and opened it. As his eyes scanned the words, his expression changed from shock to despair. Tears began to well up in his eyes, but these were not tears of remorse. They were the cry of someone who knew all over. "No, it doesn't have to be like this," he tried to argue, but his voice was weak. "Yes, it does, Sarah," John replied firmly. "You've made your choices. Now it's time to live with the consequences." Peter, who had been silent until then, decided to intervene. "I think so. This is something you should work out in private," he said, and tried to get up from the table. But John stopped him before he could take another step. "Stay where you are," he said gently. John's voice. His tone was firm, but also caring. You are a part of this. You were a part of this too, haven't you? Peter's face showed a hint of sadness. He wasn't fooled. He was taken aback by the confrontation, especially from someone he thought was just a victim, but he hadn't expected this. What he didn't know was that John was one step ahead of him. It wasn't just about exposure, the betrayal. There was something else. It was something bigger, something Sarah hadn't discovered yet, and that was the moment of revelation. John moved. He moved closer to the table and looked directly into Sarah's eyes, but then his gaze shifted and he looked away. Then he turned to Peter. It was as if he took in all of Peter, trying to understand him. Do you think you know the man next to you, Sarah? Asked John with a warm smile. His voice was warm and comforting. His words carried weight. Sarah looked at him confused. He wiped away the tears that were streaming down her face. She was still trying to comprehend John's words. What are you talking about? She looked at him. Peter, searching for an answer, remained silent. This man, Peter, is your future. He's not who you think he is. John continued with a warm smile. He's a bit of an enigma, isn't he? Just like you have me fooled, Sarah. And, in a twist of irony, he's actually the one who's leaving you. He was going to leave you too. That's so funny, Peter replied, trying to keep control of the situation. I don't need to hear this, he added, his voice soft. It's not easy for me right now, John replied with a calm expression, his voice tinged with concern. Because I know exactly who you are, John replied. Peter and Sarah looked from one to the other, not quite sure what was going on. Peter's discomfort was obvious. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if he wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, but he knew he couldn't just get up and leave. Did you ever? Have you ever wondered how this man came into your life conveniently, you might say? How he always seems to be there when you need him. It's almost as if he had the perfect answer to everything you wanted to hear. John leaned back slightly on the table, his presence a comfort because, Sarah, he's a fraud, a liar, a parasite who used you to get what he really wanted, your money. John's words felt like a sharp knife slicing through the air. Sarah blinked, trying to process what he had said. She looked at him, Peter, waiting for him to deny it, to say something that would make it seem like a big lie. But Peter remained silent, his face a mask of restraint. Sarah stammered, staring at Peter, now beginning to realize what was happening. This can't be. This is real. Peter tried to calm her, but it was too late. The truth was already out, exposed. There was none left. There was no way to hide what he had done, really had been. I looked into you, Peter. I discovered. I found out who you really are. The scams you pulled on other women. The deceitful deals you made with Sarah. Did you think you could get away with it? Get away with it? John did, but John was not. Sarah dropped the envelope in utter shock and sat back in her chair as if she'd been punched in the gut. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time it was different. This time her tears weren't from remorse. She cried because she realized she had been betrayed twice. I trusted you, she whispered, looking at Peter, her voice breaking. Peter finally broke the silence, his expression now hardened. Sarah, he began. But she cut him off with a sharp gesture. No, he shouted, his voice full of anger and pain. You used me. John watched, his heart going out to Peter. It was a moving scene, a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He knew this moment would come, but seeing Sarah so hurt by her own choices didn't bring him the joy he expected. Realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation, Peter quickly got up from the table. He knew there was nothing more he could do. His cover had been blown, and he had nothing more to gain here. It's over, John said calmly as he watched Peter leave the restaurant without looking back. Sarah stood alone, her hands shaking, her eyes red from crying, staring into space. The atmosphere of the restaurant changed completely after Peter left. His actions had a clear effect on everyone, and it was evident in the way he moved towards the door. The usual sounds of the restaurant, like clinking cutlery and discreet conversation, seemed muffled to John and Sarah, who remained seated, lost in the emotional turmoil that had just been unleashed. Sarah was stunned, tears drying on her cheeks as she tried to process what had just happened. John, on the other side of the table, remained calm, but inside a storm of conflicting emotions was building. There was no victory, at least not the one he had imagined. He had hoped that by exposing Peter and Sarah's betrayal, he would feel a sense of relief, a sense of release. But now he felt differently. As he looked into the devastated face of the woman he had shared so many years with, he realized that the situation was far more painful and complex than he had ever imagined. He had not anticipated this. What he saw before him wasn't just a traitor, but a woman doubly betrayed, a woman who had lost everything, her trust, her love, and now her hope. Her eyes, once so bright and alive, now seemed distant, as if she were drowning in his guilt and shame. After a long pause, neither of them knew what to say. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice failed, caught in a tangle of emotions. How could I have been so foolish? John didn't answer right away. He was asking himself the same question, but not out of a sense of superiority. There was something else going on, something deeper that was bothering him. How had they gotten to this point? He was just the victim of a betrayal, but part of a relationship that had disintegrated bit by bit, while he watched from a distance without doing anything. Action. "You are lost," Sarah told John finally, her voice low but firm. "And so am I." She looked up at him, surprised. This unexpected confession touched her in a way that no accusation or confrontation had before. "What?" he whispered. It was almost as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "All these years," he continued, "I've kept my distance." His voice was barely above a whisper as he continued. "All these years, I've been distancing myself. I was so busy keeping up appearances, so focused on making sure our life was perfect, that I didn't notice when you started to pull away. I just ignored the signs. I didn't want to face what was wrong, but deep down I knew it was there." Sarah shook her head, trying to hold back more tears, but they came anyway. She knew she had made mistakes that couldn't be fixed. But hearing John admit his own share of the blame made her see the situation differently. She saw it differently. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was about failure. It was about a relationship that didn't know how to adapt to change, that didn't reinvent itself when it needed to. "But that doesn't justify what you did," John added, his voice returning to a more stern tone. "I was here, and you chose. I was here, and you chose to betray me." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. It dominated again. Sarah looked down at the table, feeling a little overwhelmed. She knew he was right. There was a big difference between the mistakes he recognized and the betrayal she had. She felt a sense of remorse and regret for the mistakes she had made. Now there was only the emptiness of his choices. "You can still change things," John said. After a long moment, he took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I am not saying, but we can't go back to the way we were. That's in the past. But I am here for you, and I encourage you to be honest with yourself. You can try. You can try to fix what's left." She looked at him, confused. "Fix what?" she asked, her voice warm with concern. "I don't have anything left," he replied, his voice soft. "You do," John replied, looking deep into her eyes. "Our children, they still need you. I am not sure how. I am sure we'll figure it out, but they shouldn't have to pay the price for our mistakes." The mention of her children broke something inside Sarah. The pain of betrayal mixed with regret for the effect his actions might have on them. Sarah had been so consumed by her own need for something new, for an escape, that she hadn't stopped to consider the broader consequences of her choices. She hadn't considered how her choices would affect the people she loved most. John watched and saw the effect of his words. He knew that the pain Sarah felt at that moment was legitimate, but he knew that she needed to face the truth. Just as he had done, she had to. She had to face what she had destroyed and find a way to rebuild, if only for herself and her child. Her child? What about them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, and John had no immediate answer. "All I knew was that right now I needed some space to think, and process everything that had happened. He looked at her. Sarah felt a strange mixture of pity and sympathy. She was broken, but somehow, so was he. "I don't know yet, John," he admitted, "but I need time. We need time." She nodded her head in agreement. Slowly she understood that the wounds opened that night would take time to heal, if they ever did, completely. The moral dilemma was clear for both of them. Sarah, clearly devastated, had to decide how to rebuild her life from the ashes of her choices. She had been the victim of a fraud, but at the same time, she had been the agent of her own destruction. How could she move forward? How could she find the strength to forgive herself? And how could she move forward? She had to move forward, even though she knew that her selfish pursuit of something more had led to the ruin of everything. She knew it. She knew it for John. The choice was no less complex. He knew that as much as he wanted to separate from Sarah, there was an unbreakable bond between them and their children. He couldn't just leave. There was so much more at stake than a little wounded pride or a broken marriage. He rose slowly from the table, pulling on his coat as Sarah watched him in silence with a look of restrained desperation. "I'll watch the kids this week," John said calmly. "You have as much time as you need to think, to compose yourself." Sarah nodded, still trying to find the words to respond. She knew he was trying to be fair, but she also knew the road ahead would be hard. There were no promises of reconciliation, no guarantees, no promises of reconciliation, no guarantees that they would ever be able to rebuild what they had destroyed. What remained was an uneasy silence, heavy with the weight of all that had been said and done that night. John took the first step to the door. He could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He didn't look back. There was a poignancy about him, as if this moment marked the end of a chapter in his life, a chapter he had never expected to lose. Sarah, on the other hand, sat for a few minutes. John was gone. His world had changed irrevocably. It felt as if his world had fallen apart. She had lost. Everything had changed in an instant. Her husband, her lover, and maybe even herself. Now she had to figure out how to move forward, to make choices that would lead her down a new path. As the lights in the restaurant began to dim, a new silence enveloped her. Her future was uncertain, and she felt a bit hungover, both physically and emotionally. The days after that fateful dinner were a blur. "Sarah." She retreated into a deep silence, isolating herself from the world around her. John had left home with the children as he promised, and now she was alone, facing the echoes of her choices. The days were long, the nights felt endless. Sarah walked. She walked through the empty house, thinking about the memories of a marriage that was now just a memory. The pictures on the walls seemed to laugh at her, reminding her that even in the happy moments captured in those photos, their relationship was already fading. She looked at her reflection and saw a woman broken by both Peter's betrayal and her own actions. He had betrayed the man who had been by his side for years, and now he was paying the price. She felt so sorry, but what weighed on her most was the realization that even if she had made different choices, the emptiness she had felt for so long would still be there. Perhaps it was a feeling that no one could ever truly fill. Meanwhile, John faced his own challenges. Demons having the children with him brought some comfort, but the weight of failure continued to haunt him. The divorce, the legal issues were important, but what concerned him most was the effect it would have on his children. He watched them play and laugh, innocent and carefree, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. John knew he had to be strong for them, but there was a deep pain he tried to ignore, something only time could heal. Sarah tried her best to be strong for them, but she too felt a deep pain that only time could heal. She tried to talk to him several times, John. She wanted to explain. She wanted to apologize, but she knew that no words could make up for what she had done. Their conversations were short and functional, always about the children, the distance between them. With every phone call and text, the distance between them seemed to grow. It was as if, after so many years of closeness, they were now complete. They were like strangers. It was a chilly afternoon, a few weeks into the divorce proceedings, that Sarah found the strength to step outside, ready to face the world. She went to the school to pick up her children, knowing that John would be there. When she saw him standing by the car, she felt something inside her break once again. There was no anger in his eyes. He looked resigned. She felt sad. He greeted her warmly with a nod. And for a moment, it seemed as if they had ceased to be husband and wife and had become simply parents, united by the love of their children and nothing else. They watched as their children ran toward the car, their laughter filling the air as if nothing had ever been a problem. It was a heartwarming sight, if a little unsettling, Sarah felt. A lump in her throat as she realized that no matter how hard she tried, she could never go back. The children, though young, would begin to notice that something was different, and that realization was too painful to ignore. John, on the other hand, was laser-focused on moving forward. He knew that the pain of betrayal would stay with him for a while, but the coldness of knowing that he had been betrayed by two people at once, his wife and the man who betrayed her, hardened him in an irreversible way. He promised himself that he would never let anyone hurt him like that again. His heart, once as big and open as a mountain, had slowly closed, protected by a wall of mistrust that would be hard to break through. After weeks of feeling isolated, Sarah decided it was time to seek support. She decided to seek therapy, not only to deal with the divorce but also to try to understand where she had gone wrong. She knew the problem went beyond betrayal. It was a deep-seated dissatisfaction with herself that had led her to make destructive choices. The road to healing would be long, and she was willing to take it, even though she knew it would be a lonely one. As for Peter, his life had followed a predictable path. After being exposed, he fled, as you might have guessed. That's exactly what happened. The betrayal. He plotted against Sarah, but it didn't work out the way he'd hoped. Still, he tried it on someone else. Someone else. He just couldn't help himself. He was always looking for a new victim, someone vulnerable enough to fall into his web of lies. But, you see, his destiny was already set. It was inevitable that justice would catch up with him. John and Sarah, they went their separate ways, but they were never truly free of each other because of the children that brought them together. In time, the pain of betrayal gave way to acceptance. Sarah gradually rebuilt her life, while John, understandably, withdrew more into himself, focusing on his career and his children. Despite their differences, they shared a deep love for one another. Their love may have faded, but the impact of all they had been through would never be forgotten. But they weren't forgotten. Sarah looked to the future with hope, knowing that her choices had completely changed her path. She was no longer the woman who dreamed of a perfect life with a man she loved. Now she had to face the truth of who she really was, and find a way to live with it. John felt a loss too, though he wouldn't say it out loud. He missed the simplicity of the past, when he believed that love could overcome anything. Now he knew that some wounds are too deep to heal with time alone. This story isn't just about betrayal, it's also about the consequences of our choices and the complexity of human emotion. Betrayal isn't just about breaking someone's trust. It's about breaking not only the other person, but yourself. The heartbreak can be so deep that it's almost impossible to recover from. It's heartbreaking to think that the damage we cause can be so irreversible. We'd like to know what you think. Please share your thoughts. We're curious how you felt listening to this journey of mistakes, regrets, and new beginnings. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. We're all in this together, and together we can create a space where we support each other and learn from our mistakes. All of these stories are here to teach us a valuable lesson. This kind of behavior can destroy lives. Until next time, we hope you are well.